Today we're going straight to the heart of Indian philosophy.
Okay.
We're going to be exploring the relationship between Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism.
Right.
Now, on the surface, Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism, they can seem like totally different systems, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Advaita, which is rooted in Hindu tradition, emphasizes the oneness of the individual soul,
Right.
which is called Atman,
Mm-hmm.
with the ultimate reality, which is called Brahman.
Yeah.
But Buddhism, while also originating in India, focuses on achieving liberation from suffering through the understanding of impermanence
Yes.
and no self, or anatta.
Okay, so right away we've got this kind of tension.
Yeah.
One system is pointing to an eternal self merging with the ultimate.
Right.
And the other one's saying there's no self at all.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
What do we make of that?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
Big question. Did they influence each other?
Right.
Is there some kind of hidden connection between these seemingly opposite ideas?
Those are the questions that we're going to be exploring.
Okay, let's get into it.
All right, so one thing that's interesting is that both Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism arose in India.
Okay.
So they share some common ground.
Right.
They both talk about karma, rebirth, and the pursuit of liberation from suffering.
Makes sense they come from similar cultural background.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that our sources suggest that early Buddhism didn't really engage with the Upanishads,
Right.
which are like the foundational texts for Vedanta.
That's right, and that's a key point.
Right.
Because the concept of Atman, that permanent self, that wasn't central to early Buddhist thought.
Okay.
Their focus was elsewhere.
Interesting. And von Glasenapp, he really drives this point home
Oh, yeah.
in his study when he says, nothing shows better the great distance that separates the Vedanta and the teachings of the Buddha than the fact that the two principal concepts of Upanishadic wisdom, Atman and Brahman, do not appear anywhere in the Buddhist texts, with the clear and distinct meaning of a primordial ground of the world core of existence ends realissimum, or similarly.
So in the early stages, it seems like they were on pretty separate tracks.
Right. But then we hit this central clash, Atman versus Anatta.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting.
Right. So Advaita is asserting that the Atman exists and is identical with Brahman.
Yes.
But then Buddhism counters and says there is no permanent self at all.
And that's often where people get stuck.
Right.
They think it's a matter of one being right and the other being wrong.
Totally.
But I think it's more nuanced than that.
Okay.
Because Buddhism isn't denying that we experience ourselves as individuals or that we have unique personalities.
So it's not about denying the appearance of a self.
Exactly. It's more about recognizing that what we perceive as self is constantly changing.
Okay.
It's a flow of experiences, thoughts, emotions, perceptions,
Yeah.
not some fixed, unchanging entity.
So instead of a solid, static self, it's more like a process.
A process.
Yeah.
A flow.
Yeah, flame. A flame.
Yeah. It seems to have a consistent form, but in reality, it's fuel being consumed, energy being released.
Yeah.
Constant change.
I like that. That's a really helpful analogy.
Good.
It makes me wonder, though, how does that apply to this idea of merging with the ultimate? Because if there's no fixed self in Buddhism, what is it that merges or awakens or achieves liberation?
That's a great question, and that actually takes us deeper into the Buddhist understanding of consciousness and reality.
Okay.
And it was a point where the form discussion got particularly lively.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some of the participants who identify as Buddhists, they actually challenged the Advaita concept of Tat Divam Asi.
Which means?
You are that, and Aham Brahmasmi.
I am Brahman.
Right.
That's surprising. Why would they challenge those core Advaita teachings?
Their concern was that holding on to a concept of a separate self,
Yeah.
even one that is ultimately identical to Brahman,
Right.
could be a subtle form of clinging.
Okay. So even though Advaita aims for non-duality, the use of self-language might actually be a stumbling block.
That's the argument some were making.
Interesting. And it brings us to another question. Did these systems, despite their differences, influence each other in any way?
Now that's what I'm really curious about.
Me too. Let's dig into that.
Okay, so things get really interesting when we start looking at Mahayana Buddhism,
Okay.
which emerged later than early Buddhism.
Hmm.
And with Mahayana Buddhism, we see concepts like emptiness
Right.
or shunyata,
Yeah.
which, while different from Brahman,
Okay.
have a certain resonance with that Advaita idea of a non-dual reality.
So there's a potential point of connection there, even if the details are different.
Right, and our sources actually mention a few figures
Right.
who might help us understand this possible cross-pollination.
Okay. Let's hear it.
So there's Gautamata.
Gakkata.
He's an early Advaita thinker.
Okay.
And he seemed to use Buddhist terminology
Interesting.
and maybe even some Buddhist ideas in his work.
Okay, so he's kind of a bridge figure, potentially.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character.
Yeah?
And a real source of debate.
Okay.
Because some later Hindu scholars even claimed he was a crypto-Buddhist.
A crypto-Buddhist? What does that even mean?
Basically sneaking Buddhist teachings into Advaita.
Oh, wow. So like undercover Buddhist.
Kinda, yeah.
Was there any evidence to back that up?
It's a really complex question.
Yeah.
And scholars are divided on it.
Okay.
I mean, his work does include terms
Uh-huh.
and concepts that have parallels in Buddhist philosophy,
Right.
especially his Mandukya Karika,
The Mandukya Karika.
but the interpretation is key.
So it's not just about the words themselves,
Right.
but how he used them.
Exactly.
Like take his Ajatavada,
Ajatavada.
the doctrine of non-origination.
Okay.
Now, on the surface,
Yeah.
it sounds similar to Buddhist teachings on emptiness.
Okay.
But our Wikipedia source actually points out some crucial differences.
Okay, like what?
Well, Gaudapada was working within the framework of the Upanishads,
Right.
and his idea of an unchanging, non-dual reality
Okay.
with its own essential nature
Yeah.
is a departure from the Buddhist emphasis on impermanence and no self.
So he might have been using familiar Buddhist terms as tools to explain Vedantic concepts?
Right.
But not necessarily endorsing Buddhist philosophy wholesale.
Yeah, it's one interpretation.
Okay, but the crypto-Buddhist accusations,
Yeah.
they didn't stop with Gaudapada.
No, they didn't.
They went on to Shankara, who we've already mentioned
Yeah.
as a key figure in Advaita Vedanta.
Yeah, he seems to have been a magnet for controversy.
Why was he accused of being a crypto-Buddhist?
While some scholars,
Okay.
especially those from rival Hindu schools of thought, okay,
Saw his concept of Maya,
my,
or illusion,
right.
as too close for comfort to Buddhist ideas.
Really?
Yeah, so even though he's considered this giant of Advaita,
Mm-hmm.
his own ideas kind of sparked suspicion.
Interesting. So even within the Advaita tradition, there was debate and disagreement
Yeah, definitely.
about the influence of Buddhism.
For sure. But to be fair to Shankara,
Okay.
he did offer strong counterarguments to Buddhism,
Okay.
particularly in his commentaries on the Brahma Sutras.
What were his main points of contention?
He was really concerned with what he perceived as the nihilistic implications
Okay.
of some Buddhist teachings.
Interesting.
He argued that there must be a cognizer.
A cognizer.
Yeah, something beyond just the act of cognition.
Okay. And for him, that cognizer was the Atman.
Exactly. The self-evident Atman,
Okay.
the witness consciousness.
Which, of course, is where Buddhists would strongly disagree.
Absolutely. They'd
Yeah.
say there's no need to posit a permanent self
Right.
or witness.
So we're back to that fundamental difference in their understanding of the self.
Right. And it sounds like these accusations,
Yeah.
whether aimed at Gaudapada or Shankara,
Mm-hmm.
highlight how these schools of thought
Okay.
were really engaging with each other,
Yeah.
even if it was through critique.
Right. So it wasn't just parallel development,
Yeah.
but a dynamic exchange of ideas.
A real philosophical conversation spanning centuries.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
You love that. And that leads us to another key difference.
Okay.
They're epistemologies.
Epistemologies.
Oh.
Yeah, now we're getting into the technical
I don't
term.
want, all right. But what does that even mean?
Well, epistemology is the study of knowledge.
Okay.
How we know what we know.
Right.
What are the valid sources of knowledge?
Okay.
And Buddhism generally relies on perception and inference
Okay.
as its main ways of knowing.
So what we directly experience
Exactly.
and what we can logically deduce from those experiences
Right.
makes sense.
Advaita Vedanta adds 4 more.
For more,
Yeah.
on top of perception and inference.
Comparison, verbal testimony,
Okay.
implication, and non-apprehension.
Wow, 6 ways of knowing.
Yeah.
What do those extra 4 entail?
Okay, so comparison
Yeah.
involves understanding something by comparing it to something else.
Okay, makes sense.
Verbal testimony is accepting knowledge from trusted sources,
Uh-huh.
like scriptures or teachers.
Okay. I can see how those would be important
Yeah,
in a tradition that values lineage and sacred texts.
exactly.
Yeah.
Then we have implication,
Okay.
which is understanding something based on what it implies or necessitates,
Okay.
and then non-apprehension.
Yeah.
Which is a little more complex.
Okay.
It's about the absence of an experience,
Uh-huh.
proving the non-existence of something.
Okay, so it's like if you can't experience it,
Right.
then it doesn't exist.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, so these different epistemologies
Yeah.
really shape how they approach understanding reality itself.
Right, and this actually leads us to another crucial distinction.
Hit me.
They're ontologies.
Ontologies. Okay, what is that?
Ontology is the study of being,
Yee.
what exists.
Right.
What is the fundamental nature of reality?
Okay, so epistemology is how we know.
Right.
Ontology is what is...
Exactly.
Got it. So how do their ontologies differ?
So Advaita Vedanta leans toward substance ontology.
Substance ontology.
Yeah. There's an underlying, unchanging reality
Okay.
beneath all the ever-changing appearances.
Kind of like that ocean we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
The waves are changing, but the ocean itself remains.
Right. Buddhism, on the other hand, is more aligned with a process ontology.
No process ontology.
Where everything is in constant flux, interconnected, and dependent on conditions.
So no fixed substances.
Right.
Just this dynamic web of relationships.
Exactly.
Constantly in motion.
Precisely.
Yeah. These are fundamental differences.
They are.
In how they view knowledge and the nature of reality.
And these differences really shape their entire worldviews.
Yeah.
And explain why they arrive at such different conclusions about the self and liberation.
Okay. This is all fascinating.
Good.
But I have to admit, it's getting pretty heady.
Yeah.
Is there a way to connect this back to that everything and everything concept that we mentioned at the beginning? We kind of skimmed over that.
Yeah, we did.
I feel like it could offer a different way of looking at these two philosophical systems.
It could.
Maybe even find some common ground. I think we should definitely circle back to that everything and everything idea.
Yeah, for sure.
I feel like it could offer a different way of looking at these two philosophies.
It really could.
Maybe even find some common ground.
Absolutely. So it suggests a model of reality.
Okay.
Where everything is interconnected and interdependent.
Okay.
Where each part contains the whole.
Okay.
It's like a hologram.
You know what? That reminds me of Indra's net.
Indra's net.
I remember reading about that in a Buddhist text.
Right.
It's this image of a vast net with jewels at each intersection.
Okay.
And each jewel reflects all the others infinitely. It's a really beautiful way to visualize interconnectedness.
It is a beautiful image.
So this idea of everything in everything,
Yeah.
it raises some intriguing questions for me.
Like what?
Well, like, could it be a way to understand the relationship between Atman and Brahman?
In Advaita Vedanta.
Yeah, in Advaita Vedanta.
That's a great question.
Instead of seeing them as two separate entities, maybe they're more like two aspects of the same reality, each reflecting the other.
It's an interesting thought.
And if we look at the Buddhist concept of dependent origination,
right.
the idea that all things arise in dependence upon other things,
yes.
There's a similar sense of interconnectedness there.
For sure.
So maybe everything and everything could be a bridge between these seemingly different ontologies.
I like that.
A way to see Advaita's substance and Buddhism's process as two sides of the same coin.
It's a thought-provoking idea.
It really is.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if all those historical debates and accusations of crypto-Buddhism were focusing on the differences while missing a deeper underlying unity.
It's possible.
Yeah.
And it's maybe one of the pitfalls of intellectual analysis.
Yeah.
Sometimes it leads to fragmentation rather than integration.
So everything is kind of an invitation to look for the connections, the points of resonance, the ways in which these seemingly different systems might actually be complementing and enriching each other.
I think that's a valuable insight.
And ultimately, these are living traditions.
They are.
They're not just abstract philosophical systems.
Right.
And they've been in dialogue with each other for centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. Influencing and shaping each other.
Okay, so speaking of living traditions, how do these philosophical differences play out in practice?
That's a great question.
Like, if someone is drawn to the ideas of Advaita Vedanta or Buddhism, what would their path look like?
Well, that's where we see some practical distinctions. So Advaita Vedanta emphasizes self-inquiry.
Okay.
A deep questioning of one's own nature and identity. It also values meditation and the study of scriptures like the Upanishads.
So it's about directly realizing that identity between Atman and Brahman.
Yes.
Breaking free from the illusion of separation.
Exactly. Whereas in Buddhism, the emphasis is on practices like mindfulness and ethical conduct.
Okay.
Cultivating compassion and wisdom through direct experience.
So there's more of a focus on understanding impermanence and interconnectedness and seeing through the illusion of a separate self.
Exactly.
So both traditions are aiming for liberation from suffering and ultimately some kind of awakening. But the paths they take can look quite different.
They do. But maybe as with the everything and everything model, These paths are not entirely separate,
Yeah.
but rather like different trails
Okay.
leading up the same mountain.
Beautiful analogy.
Why
So
not?
after all this, where do we land? Are Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism fundamentally opposed?
All right.
Or are they two sides of the same coin?
I think, as with most profound philosophical inquiries,
Yeah.
there's not a single easy answer.
Right.
But what we've discovered
Mm-hmm.
is that reducing these traditions to simple opposition
Yeah.
misses all the nuances,
Right.
the historical interactions,
Mm-hmm.
and the potential for deeper unity.
And maybe that's okay.
I think it is.
Maybe the journey itself,
Yeah.
the exploration, the questioning
Right.
is more important than reaching a definitive conclusion.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes this deep dive so rewarding.
It really is.
It's not about finding the right answer.
Yeah.
It's about expanding our understanding, appreciating the richness and complexity of human thought
Right.
as we grapple with these big questions.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From Atman and Anatta to epistemology and ontology,
Right.
from historical controversies to modern interpretations.
It's been a journey.
This has been a truly mind-bending exploration.
It has. And hopefully it's sparked some new insights and questions for our listeners out there.
Absolutely. We encourage you to check out the show notes. We've got links to all the sources that we've talked about.
And let us know what you think.
Yeah, what stands out to you?
What resonates with your own experience.
What resonates with your own search for meaning?
Exactly.
And maybe, just maybe, this deep dive has planted a seed of curiosity
It might.
that will continue to grow and blossom.
And we encourage you to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.
Until next time.